Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this tutorial series on baking low poly mechanical objects in Blender. In this video I'll be setting up the low poly mesh that I created in the last video for baking, and that's going to involve adding UV seams, doing the UV unwrapping, and then straightening those UVs for better baking, creating a cage object, and then finally baking 3 different texture maps: a normal map, an ambient occlusion map, and a material ID map. Okay, I'm now at the point where I want to start adding seams, UV seams, to this mesh so that I can unwrap it nicely. I'll start by creating seams everywhere there is a sharp edge. So I'll just select all of these edges that I marked as sharp manually earlier. And as I select them, I'll go Control E, mark seam. Try to select edge loops by holding down Alt and Shift. Speeds up the process a little bit. Mark them as a seam. And after all of the sharp edges are marked as seams, we'll have to go and add some additional seams in order to get a clean unwrap. But first, let's just make sure that there are no sharp edges that are not seams, because sharp edges that are not seams look really bad once you've baked them. Normal maps don't play nice with sharp edges. Unless they're a seam, you end up with really noticeable aliasing. Looks like I've accidentally created a few seams at the end here because they were attached to edge loops. I'll have to go back and remove them. And let's try and get rid of these, because flat surfaces should generally be unwrapped as a single island. Clear those seams, and we just have the end opposite the pulley to finish now. Okay, it looks like all of the sharp edges have been turned into seams as well. Oh, there's one I missed. Okay, so now I have to think about how is this mesh going to unwrap. Now obviously a continuous surface that goes all the way around like this, we need to pick a spot as a seam. So I'll just be trying to find the most discrete place I can think of. Looking down into the engine bay, this is the view. So I'll be trying to keep the seams on the other side of the mesh. Objects or shapes that are kind of cylindrical like this one, you either need to separate the round surface from the edge, or you need to add a seam at intervals so that it can spread out properly. In this case, I'm just going to unwrap the side as basically a long strip, and the end can just be a flat circle. Okay, looks like that's basically ready to try and unwrap, and then we can identify any areas that still need more seams. First, need to create an image. So we'll go into the UV editor and make a new image, and I'll call this engbay3 underscore bake because I've already done a couple of these. And I'll keep the size at 1024 square at the moment. That should be enough for what I'm doing. And I'll also create a new material with about the same name. I'll just call it engbay3. And now I'll hit the unwrap button and adjust the margin a little bit so we don't have too much margin. And that seems to have worked pretty well. I'll have to go back around and make sure that there's no really stretched areas, but I think adding those seams basically did the job. So I'll go to shader editor. One thing we need to do before baking is just add a texture, an image texture. You don't need to connect it to anything. Add a texture for engbay3 and just make sure it's that texture that we just created, the engbay3 underscore bake. And that just ensures that anytime we bake to this object, the target for the bake is going to be this image. So we'll go back to the UV editor. And I just like to do a bit of straightening before we start baking. So I'll be using proportional edit, and let's do connected only. And I'll also use the 3D cursor and try to place that at a pivot point to help me straighten out these UVs. When you have a UV island that's nearly straight, it's really helpful just to go and straighten it all the way, and that helps avoid any artifacts from aliasing, any blocky looking edges with steps. So I can just select these edge loops here, and I'm just going to scale them to 0 along the x-axis. And I won't worry too much about this one because that's not a straight edge anyway. And then I'll go in, and it's worth taking a bit of time just to make sure all the edges are orthogonal. It can be a little bit time consuming. Okay, so that should bake really nicely now. Just look around. If you have a string of quads like this, you can actually use the text tool add-on. It's got a handy tool to rectify things. So you just select the island and then rectify it. That's really quick. But for more complex shapes that aren't quads, you basically have to do them manually. Okay, now that that's all unwrapped and the UVs are looking pretty solid, it's going to be time to set up the high poly mesh for baking. Now I'll go back to the shader editor, and what we have to do is look at the list of materials on these objects. So there's actually 3 of them. I have an aluminium material that's using a bevel node, which is going to help bring out some of the details in the normal map. It will help it look a lot more smooth. And there's a steel material also with a bevel shader, and a plastic material with a bevel shader. You just have to make sure that all of these materials have a selected texture, and that selected texture is engbay3 underscore bake. The next step is to create a cage object. Now, a cage object is basically just a duplicate of the low poly mesh with a little bit of an offset, and its job is to capture all of the geometry data from the high poly object and apply it to the low poly. So in order to create that cage, I'm just going to duplicate the low poly with Alt-D, and that actually preserves the link of mesh data, so that if we need to change the mesh, it will also be applied to the cage object. Now we go into modifiers and add a displace modifier and just give that a strength of 0.001 or 1 millimeter, which, as you can see, just offsets it very slightly from the low poly mesh. And I'm going to set this to display as bounds so that it's not going to get in the way of viewing the low poly mesh. I'll name it supercharger underscore cage. You have to name it as something, because in the bake panel you need to enter in the cage object's name. So we have the high poly object, supercharger high poly, the low charger, supercharger low poly, and the cage, supercharger cage. I'm just going to find them in the scene collection. There they are, and I'm going to disable everything else in that collection from rendering to make sure we're not getting any interference. Now this is where the fun part hopefully begins. We're going to attempt to bake, and I'm going to set the render samples to 32. That should work pretty well for a normal map bake. And we're going to bake a normal map, as I just mentioned. Make sure we have the correct cage object specified. So supercharger cage, and I'm going to set a margin of 16 pixels, and that will help to make sure there are no artifacts from the edge of a UV island creeping into the texture. Okay, and now we select the high poly object and shift select the low poly object, and we're baking selected to active. So that's the selected object, which is the high poly, to the active or the low poly. Okay, now we're going to bake and see what happens. And there we have it. So it looks like it's worked pretty well. I don't see any obviously wrong colors. They all seem to be in the correct spectrum, with this sort of medium purplish blue as the base, with the colors being bent around the edges of the islands. So it looks pretty good at first glance. We'll just have to save that to a file. So I'll go image, save as, and then I'll find my baking folder, and we'll just save it as engbay3, and I'll rename bake to normal so we know exactly what we're dealing with. So save that image, and then I'm going to go back to the shader editor, and we're going to try and preview this. So remember, we assigned a material to the low poly mesh called engbay3. So now I'm just going to grab that image that we just baked, engbay3 normal, and create a normal map from that. Make sure it's linear color space, and then plug the normal into the shader. And it's a bit difficult to see without much lighting, so I'm just going to turn on metallic to make it a bit more obvious. And there we have it. That's a really clean bake. I'm quite happy with that. I don't think it's going to need much tweaking at all. Now I'm also going to bake an ambient occlusion map, which will help some of these details pop a little more. So in order to do that, we'll just use the same target, which will be engbay3 underscore bake, that image we made earlier. Just make sure to reselect it and unhook this normal map, because we don't need to be baking normal data, we're baking ambient occlusion. And we're going to change the bake type to ambient occlusion. I'm just going to use 32 samples. You probably should use more, but this will work for the purpose of the tutorial. And everything else should remain the same. We're going to use 16 margin again. go back to UV editor and we'll hit bake and wait for that. And I've made a mistake here. You have to select the high poly and then select the low poly and then bake. That should be working now. Okay, the bake is just about to finish, and there we go. There's the ambient occlusion, and that looks fairly good. Seems to behave like you'd expect ambient occlusion to, with just a bit of darkness in the crevices. So I'll save that. I'll save that as a file called ngba3_AO. And let's go back to the shader editor and we'll preview. Let's hook the normal back up. Make sure it's in linear color space. And oh, this is actually the wrong file path, so I'll just make sure it's pointing to the normal map. There we go. And now this one, I'll find the image we just saved, which is the ambient occlusion map, and hook that up to base color. So this is helping us get a little bit more definition in the color. And if we take away the normal, you can see the contribution that the ambient occlusion makes on its own. But together, it's starting to look quite good, and these will be really useful maps in Substance Painter later on. There's just one more map I'd like to bake, and that's a material ID map. So going back to our shader editor, I'm just going to unhook the normal and the base color, and we'll make sure that the target image in the low poly mesh is set to this same image we've been baking to this whole time, ngba3_bake. And now let's just hide this for a second, and we'll look at our high poly mesh. And as you can see, I've set the emission on these 3 different materials to 3 colors, and they will be the colors that appear in the material ID map. So I'll just unhide the low poly mesh, and we're going to be baking the emit value. You only need to use one sample when you're baking an ID map, because it's just going to be solid color. You don't have to worry about graininess or noise. So select the high poly, select the low poly, and bake type, emit. There we go, and bake. Okay, and there we have it. That's the map of the different materials, and that will be useful in Substance Painter.